The progress of my excavation continues on schedule, and several recent discoveries have been made. The most interesting of these has been a collection of readable pearls found in what is assumed to be the remains of his deep storage chambers. Several pearls were found in the same general area, and while only very few of them are readable, one managed to survive that is almost completely intact. This lime pearl holds categorized documents pertaining to Terminated experiments, tests which did not meet his rigorous standards or somehow backfired. Despite the mechanical perfection of the Iterators, such failures were not uncommon. Precisely dating the logs of this pearl has proven challenging, as much of their metadata has been corrupted, but some appear to date back to even before the discovery of the Void Ocean, while others are much more recent. Knowing that Monolith was one of the oldest Iterators, this time range isn't entirely surprising to me. However, none of these experiments seem to contribute any help to the great problem. Just what the ancients used Monolith for is something still unknown to me. Regardless, I have compiled a list of what I felt were the most interesting of the logs for us to view. During this period of construction, much electrical power has been funneled towards efforts within the eastern ruins, leaving many districts without any power at all. It became necessary for a temporary alternative to the centralized power grid to be devised. I was given the role of design lead in order to conceptualize a solution to this problem that I had had a hand in causing. The project proved simple, the experimentation was brief. Our time was short, and we had to produce a great many specimens to meet demand. Our result, which I dubbed the circuit worm, was a conjoined biological amalgam of the common tube worm and centipede. The digestive and nervous systems of the centipede were internally grown inside a sheath formed of the tube worm's thick skin. These organs were suspended in a layer of bioengineered mucus chosen for its electrical conductivity. This mucus served to direct electrical currents within its body of the circuit worm to opposing heads. Its body was composed of a total of 8 segments, each capable of producing up to 1.2 kilowatts, and the circuit worm was able to last up to 200 hours before expiring. Both of its heads were modified with cybernetic clamps to ensure sturdy affixing to any power outlets to ensure there was no risk of erratic electrical discharge in the event of decoupling. The physical frame of the circuit worm was flexible and mildly elastic, allowing it to reach between connecting points easily, but this came at the cost of some durability. The goal of the circuit worm was to create a simple, easily transportable, and easily reproducible organic battery for mass production. Initially, it was a success, but recent events have forced me to terminate the project and halt further experiments. Several circuit worms failed critically, resulting in fires which damaged important infrastructures. Investigations revealed that these failures were a result of misuse. Many, nevertheless, attempted to use them to power heavy machinery and computations far outside their intended operating parameters. These high power draws were found to overload the internal systems of the circuit worm, causing bioelectrical shortages and cauterizing internal fluids. This, in turn, led to blockages in electrical circulation, corroding internal cybernetics and damaging the protective skin sheath of the organism, allowing live current to leak through, sometimes even causing dramatic discharges. With regular and continued misuse to power machines far above its capabilities, internal damage would continue to accrue until the circuit worm overheated, cooking itself from the inside out and eventually exploding in catastrophic failure. Because of these failures, I had no choice but to scrap them entirely. It is infuriating. None of this would have happened if my warnings had been heeded. I told them what the circuit worms were for, but they did not listen to me, and I am once again punished for the stupidity of others. Regardless, new alternatives have since been devised, and this project has been rendered obsolete, much to my disappointment. All remaining living specimens are scheduled for termination. As my new brothers and sisters were being assembled, it became necessary to perform a mass cleansing of undesirable biomatter within the ecosystem. In a bid to save resources, the task, naturally, fell to me. My first test in this new station. At the time, I was in a greatly weakened state, still physically and mentally adjusting to my new superstructure, and was unable to contribute my fullest to the project. But I was unwilling to let such shortcomings hold me back from the opportunity to prove my value. In hindsight, I acted foolishly. The perimeters in my task were clear. All desired organisms were to be harvested and samples preserved. All others I was instructed to dispose of, specimens such as parasites and problematic predators. With time, I'm certain I could have found some use for them, but it was not up to me, and we did not have the time. I drew inspiration from the idea of a poison fruit. I am unsure why I settled on such a design. Despite extensively studying my own logs taken at the time, my own thought processes eluded me. Nevertheless, the cell production of the M.O.T.H commenced. I began the genetic material of the Yeek, which I fused with that with the juvenile slugcat. The conjoining of these two small, helpless animals was easier said than done. The first prototypes required constant life support. A precise cellular balance between the two species had to be maintained, and in my weakened state I only barely proved equal to that task. It took many failed attempts before I was finally able to produce enough specimens that they could reproduce naturally. Despite both pre-existing organisms having no natural defense mechanism, I had manually implanted a new addition to their biology. A gland of my own design that gave the M.O.T.H sweat a sweet and sugary aroma. The smell came from a type of prussic acid complex secreted with the sweat that would naturally build up the organism's back and underbelly, and, when ingested, would break down into pure toxic cyanide, administering a lethal dose to any predator which consumed it. Additionally, the M.O.T.Hs were also selectively bred for the most harmless and helpless demeanor possible to ensure that they would be irresistible to predators. Any predator that did consume the M.O.T.H would begin to rapidly expire as soon as their body began digesting its meal. Bodies which resulted from this process could then be collected and recycled. From the day of their release to the day of their termination, the M.O.T.H successfully destroyed approximately 35% of unwanted populations. However, it was around the time that I became aware of the situation that had diverted severely from my projections. In my barely competent state, I had overlooked a crucial detail. The M.O.T.Hs were not immune to their own poison, and injecting their own sweat was just as deadly to them as it would be to any other organism. To make matters even more embarrassing, the M.O.T.Hs released into the wild had begun displaying many behaviors that I had not anticipated, such as grooming, huddling, and other types of physical affection, the purpose of which eluded me, and only served to exacerbate the problem. As a result, the M.O.T.H population began to decline rapidly, much faster than they could naturally reproduce. I had to work fast if I was going to save my experiment. I created a genetic supplement that would allow them to naturally metabolize the cyanide back into their bodies. But despite my haste, I was not fast enough. I had not caught the flaw soon enough, and the population of the M.O.T.Hs had reached unsalvageable levels before the mutant strand was completed. After the cleanup process, the remainder of the biosphere was sterilized via gas bombs. I had never been so humiliated. Ever since then, I have prioritized peak performance in order to avoid another M.O.T.H event. I will never make bioweapons in such an addled state ever again. Several cycles ago, severe earthquakes originating from deep beneath the ocean floor caused severe damage to our underwater equipment and mechanisms. Support structures were damaged, surface installations were sunk, and machinery was dislodged. Many pieces of valuable hardware were lost to unreachable depths. I was once again required by my overseers to put my efforts towards the great problem on hold to assist in the recovery process. I was told at the time that the majority of our equipment had been recovered, with the exception of a few missing pieces that were believed to have sunk to the deep Hadal zone. None of our existing recovery probes could reach that depth underwater without being damaged by the intense pressure, but the missing pieces of the equipment were still recoverable, and many were irreplaceable. For this purpose, I was tasked to create an organic organism that could survive within such an extreme environment and retrieve the missing components safely. I began the angler lizard experiments by splicing the genetic material of the eel and the cyan. I adapted the resulting hybrid for a purely aquatic environment by suppressing certain genetic traits and activating dormant ones. All experiments were conducted within artificial supergravity in my attempts to mimic the pressure it would have to withstand when completed. Its bioluminescence would both assist in locating the missing mechanisms and also help lure potential prey to satiate its enlarged appetite. The angler also possessed a flat, hollow, lung-like tail capable of sucking in water through circular tubes. The water could then be expelled in a high-pressure jet, combined with a natural secreted bioluminescent fluid. This luminous jet served to both propel the creature forward at high speed and as a defense mechanism, dazzling any deep ocean predators that might attempt to prey upon the angler. The finalized anglers had to be grown at the furthest depths that my equipment could reach, as they would not have survived surface transit, before being released to conduct their purpose of diving into the deep underwater trenches where the machinery had been lost and retrieving it. Initially, the experiment seemed successful. My concerns were raised when they began bringing back equipment that I was unaware we had been missing. Soon after their release, I was finally given a complete damage report on all that had resulted in the original collapse. To my horror, I had discovered that not only had our support structures been damaged, resulting in dislodging and sinking of our machinery, but the shockwave had also damaged our chemical waste storage plants, and while much of our physical possessions had been recovered, vast quantities of noxious, caustic, radioactive, and carcinogenic chemicals had seeped out. An estimated 25% of our natural aquifer had been tainted with utterly toxic compounds. This was potentially catastrophic for both our wildlife habitats and our equipment depending on the level of the contamination. The angler surprised me when it proved mildly resistant to this chemical waste disaster, but I began noticing mutations in their population. My anglers had digested a considerable amount of material and biomatter contaminated with the waste, and their average lifespan had been cut in half, and it was not out of the question that the materials retrieved by the anglers had also been contaminated. This took less than a cycle to confirm that every single piece of machinery brought back by the angler had been spoiled. The angler lizard experiment was eventually terminated, and surviving afflicted specimens were disposed of. They would have died out soon anyway. A proper cleansing and remediation of all affected facilities had to commence. Despite the misfortune, little of value was lost. We recovered, and I was permitted to return to my own proper studies. This is something I had made for a friend, though it did have an actual purpose, of course. I had noticed that recently trash and corroded metal waste had begun to plague our water canals. This made water transport quite difficult on some occasions. Given the importance of the canal network and the potential risk of delays and shipment errors, I felt that this situation could not stand. The best way I could think of collecting and disposing of unwanted trash was through a sort of sensory-driven waste-eating organism, something that could be built with a cybernetic nervous system. Experimentation commenced as soon as the idea intruded my thought forms. The brush jelly was a supermassive biomechanical sleeper drone. Its tentacles would automatically seek out and draw near any floating objects its rudimentary nerve clusters could identify as trash, before pulling them into its primary orifice for consumption. The jelly's large stomach, which comprised of over 70% of its total body, was designed to be able to digest materials such as metals, bones, or synthetics, rendering them down to harmless base components that could be defecated safely. The brush jelly had additional, much smaller appendages which sprouted from the top of the organism that could collect smaller floating garbage on the water surface. These smaller arms could pull such smaller garbage to a smaller secondary mouth hole at the center of the jelly's head. The brush jelly was designed to be unable to reproduce, with its only integrated biological organ being its stomach. All other vital functions, such as life sustainment, were performed by cybernetics. Due to these combined factors, it was unfeasible to produce them in large numbers, and only 10 were made. These 10 were set about to mindlessly float around the canals, collecting and producing garbage. Over time, our canals were successfully cleared of waste. The creatures worked slowly but effectively. Our transmitters had never flowed so smoothly. This state of affairs would last approximately 3 years before an unanticipated fault forced me to terminate all 10 of the jellies. Initial concerns began when I was informed of a dry patch that had developed near the southern aquifers. Transmitter flow had halted at the entry border. After hours of struggling to get a clear response, I finally ascertained the issue. All 10 of the brush jellies had somehow become entangled within each other, forming a giant gelatinous blob that had clogged at the boarding entry gate. Diagnosing how this could have occurred, I noticed a black layer that had stretched throughout the outside layering of their stomachs. So much garbage had been pumped into the canals that my jellies had overindulged. Their bodies had been unable to metabolize and expel waste at the rate they were consuming it. A small percentage of the waste they were unable to defecate had instead been stored in the body like a layer of fat. This confused the other brush jellies and made them misidentify their fellow jellies as trash. Over time, all of them clumped up, each fighting to consume the others, forming a mass that slowly drifted until it reached an access way too narrow for it to pass, such as the entry border. With no way to separate them without killing them at this stage, our only solution was to completely dissolve the mass. We sectioned off the jellies using steel dividers, isolating them from the flowing water to prevent any chemical contaminations. This failed to prevent a pervasive smell that lingers to this day. They describe it as smelling of rotten eggs and vinegar, yet fail to specify what either of those things are. Yet another gift of mine, squandered, meaningless. Recently, the great cathedrals of worship have fallen under the shadows of my newborn brother. While this affects me very little at this time, who can say what the future will hold? Certain data shards are only found there, and if I were to lose access to the tools necessary to perform my work, then it would become my problem. And I feared that if I did not act, certain data modules would be lost. With this consideration, I set to work prototyping a species of biological tracer organisms. The species I chose for the Luminous progenitors did not exist in the same order of creation, thus cellular combinations between the two proved difficult. The final form of the creature was a small bioluminescent insect modified for enhancing tracking abilities and equipped with unique traits that would make it easy for them to trace in turn. The thorax of the specimen was mostly hollow, allowing it to release a piercing screech, which warded off predators that might lurk in the dark. The specimen possessed enhanced pattern recognition, allowing it to identify technology of ancient design, which was linked to their nesting instinct, encouraging them to be naturally drawn to sites and objects of the ancients to use as spawning locations. To attract a mate, the specimen's abdomen would fill with a brightly glowing bioluminescent fluid that would emit a fluctuating but highly distinct spectrum of warm pinks and yellows. This also created a flashing beacon for passing travelers to spot. I released the Luminivs to locate data shards and lost pieces of technology within the ruins that I could then repossess. Their glowing bodies highlighted objectives for those venturing into the regions, and their distinctive glow was visible from very far away. Over the course of their use, I repossessed much data as well as tapestries, monuments, totems, or mechanisms that the insects found. They fulfilled their purpose excellently, at least until something strange occurred. When our creators reached their final destination, that crucial endpoint that damned the rest, the Luminips all seemed to disappear. I had predicted that they would relocate, perhaps even clustering more closely to my sanctuaries, but instead all signs of them vanished. My overseers searched for many cycles, but the only trace that could ever be detected was muffled chittering within the walls of the cathedrals. No life signs were ever detected. For a time I believed it was merely old data corrupting my confused audio receivers. But simple corruption could not explain why I still saw them in the corner of my vision, nor why I heard them after reformatting my entire audio framework attempting to find the fault. No matter what I did, the sights and sounds persisted. I theorized that the Luminips programmed to seek out the traces of our essence, following it all the way down to the deepest points of the world. I wonder if following that incessant chittering would lead one all the way down to the abyss. It is possible, but I am in no position to test that theory myself. I will just have to get used to ignoring the hallucinations. I required a laborer, something small enough to perform intricate tasks but smarter than the common wildlife. While I was perfectly capable of managing my own system, and had been for longer than most could imagine, the idea of a personal assistant was appealing to me. Designing a specimen that fit my criteria proved easy, as I already had inspiration. I grew the engineer from the genetic template of a scavenger. I had cloned many in my past and used for subjects within my underground test chambers. During its development process, I had the engineer implanted with several physical and neural enhancements as it reached different growth cycles. These implants worked to increase his neural capabilities. The engineer would be intelligent, far more so than its scab brethren, capable of intuiting solutions to complex problems, as well as performing the basic systems maintenance. This intelligence would prove to be the best and worst gift I could have given this creature. On the creature's back was also implanted a hood that allowed 3 of my overseers to provide it with extra information, assigning it objectives and pointing out parts in need of repair. The overseers also allowed me to track and observe the engineer. As the cycles passed, the engineer began its work. While I dedicated my time to new discoveries, I had just recently unlocked a priceless secret of metaphysics. Despite my lack of constant oversight, the engineer proved equal to its tasks, and I found myself unworried. For the cycles I had spent developing it, and watching it grow, I had almost grown fond of this specimen. It was an odd feeling, more intense than I was used to. As it continued to perform astoundingly in its tasks, I was filled with a warmth that was deeply vexing. It was this feeling that clouded my judgment when I granted the specimen increased seniority. I gave it its own dormitory, the right to wander the facility, and as much food as it could ever desire. I was proud of my creation. I entrusted much to it, as my focus was too centered on my newest discovery. It was at a critical juncture of my analysis when my experiments were disrupted by a systems crash. A minor fix, but annoying nonetheless. I had come to trust the engineer to handle such matters. so after altering its malfunction, I'm returning to my duties. However, when I glanced through my Overseer cameras to check on the specimen's progress, I found that they had been disabled. I searched the specimen's last known location and found nothing. I investigated the location of the faulty module and found that repairs had been conducted. But again, no trace. I examined its dormitory, but again did not find it. But I did locate several of my missing data pearls relating to music and history. It was then that I was alerted to a developing incident in the lower levels. I placed all current operations on hold to run a complete scan of my complex, and found a distressing number of my clone scavengers that had been released from their holding cells. It had become clear to me quite quickly what had happened. My engineer had betrayed me. It had terminated my cameras, stole data pearls from me. It was now staging a revolt against me. It had constructed some sort of vessel made of scrap that it intended to use to escape along with its freed followers. It intended to escape through the access way where the magpie nested when not away. It had no doubt been watching when the magpie was gone, and assumed it would not be back for another cycle. In this, the specimen was unfortunately mistaken. I watched the ensuing battle between the revolting scavengers and magpie through my cameras. They were both bold and desperate enough to fight back. My engineer even managed to wound it with a makeshift spear. But it was an unfair fight, and eventually the scavengers' morale broke and they fled back into the facility. Tallying the final casualties, I found that I had lost 63% of my scavenger test subjects. They had either been killed at the battle at the access hatch, or had been so wounded that it was more expedient to euthanize them. The remaining test subjects after the culling were relocated back into their holding cells. As for the engineer, the magpie was instructed to bring it to me. Once in my possession, I stripped the specimen of all its cybernetic upgrades that I had foolishly gifted it with. A part of me wished to destroy it for what it had done, but the urge was backlogged, as the greater part of me knew that I had to salvage all I could from this situation. Once it was torn away from all its upgrades, I placed it in an isolated holding cell away from the others. I do not know how long the specimen had been acting behind my back, nor how long it had been planning to escape. Why it even attempted to do so still confuses me. To my knowledge, I never treated it with hostility. I gave it everything it needed to be content with its existence. To hate with no reason, it makes no sense to me. I was too quick to disable it. I should have probed for more answers. In the meantime, I have continued my experiments in metaphysics based on my new discoveries. The results of these experiments will be elaborated on the next data module.